Welcome to this week's Who the Folk podcast. I'm Lonnie Goldsmith, the editor of TC Jewfolk. This week, we sit down with Rabbi Tobias Moss, the newest rabbi at Temple Israel. Rabbi Moss goes in depth in the many forms of Judaism in his family, what drew him to Minnesota, and why he chose to tackle Yiddish on this week's Who the Folk podcast. Rabbi Tobias Moss, welcome to the Who the Folk podcast, and welcome to the Twin Cities.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here for the first time with TC Jewfolk, and I've been following the podcast already. So
excellent. Thank you.
To be here.
We appreciate that. So you are the newest rabbi at Temple Israel. You started in July, sometime over the summer, right?
Correct. July 1st.
Okay. So we've given you a couple months before we brought you on the podcast. How has your settling both professionally and personally in the Twin Cities, how's that gone?
The transition's been much smoother than I even could have imagined. I moved from New York City.
Okay.
So often when I'm introducing myself, people say, "Oh, it's such a change to be here." And it's really fit like a glove because as much as I love the urban offerings of New York City, which Minneapolis and St. Paul can match in certain ways, I also love the nature aspect of the Twin Cities, and that's sort of that combination you can't get in New York. So it's really fit well. And also at the synagogue, I've really been welcomed into the team as a thought partner and hit the ground running, and it's been a pretty smooth transition.
So you talk about nature. I mean, New York City has, they have a big park sort of centrally located in Manhattan.
It is quite
central. Remember what it's called, though.
Yes, it is Central Park.
That's the one, yes.
And I lived just adjacent to it, so I did get to take advantage of it. But I've already hit the mountain biking trails of Theodore Wirth. And got on the water here, and it's an upgrade in that respect for sure.
Plus, you moved here at the perfect time because Minnesota summer
it's not this year round.
Sure it is. Let's go with that.
Yeah, well, actually, I interviewed at Temple Israel in February.
Oh, so you've been warned. So you understand what the year is sort of like here.
I've done my research, yes. I interviewed here in February, and I was in the positive teens temperature-wise.
Oh, there you
go.
go.
So that was sort of putting on the recruitment face, I think.
For sure.
But actually, and I'd never been here before then.
Okay.
I had a few friends that I'd studied with, and they had been huge homers for the Twin Cities. And I, as an East Coaster, sort of ignored their enthusiasm. But then when I was here in February with, all that 8 feet of snow on the ground, to my own surprise, by the end of 2 days being here, I was pretty enchanted by the city and the synagogue. And it floated to the top of my list of all my possibilities.
What was the draw to the Twin Cities for you? What was it about Temple Israel, the cities themselves, sort of the whole package that helped bring coming here to the top of your list?
There were a lot went into it. The nature and urban arts culture crossover being one of them. I also was really impressed by the synagogue board in particular, which was not a factor that I had been planning on, assessing as I went from I interviewed at 16 different synagogues by Skype. And then 4 in person. And you go into a restaurant, you don't expect that, you're going to judge the place based on, now don't be offended, board, but, by the nuts that are offered at the bar. Right? I just didn't think the board was going to feature. But then when I was meeting the board, they seemed to be really the most strategically aligned with the clergy and really be able to be partners and speak the language of the clergy. And also, they were telling me, these middle-aged men and women were telling me, in the middle of winter, I jog around the lake, and my son does urban snowboarding, and there's this spirit of adventure and embracing the winter that even for younger people, for older people, that drew me into that this place really has a culture. And yes, we have big winters in New York, but there's not a specific culture of thriving and embracing it, and it excited me that there was that here.
From a religious standpoint, how does Temple Israel, from that side of things, align with you and your beliefs and how you operate Judaically?
Great. So I grew up with every Jewish influence,
Okay.
practically, belonging to a Reconstructionist synagogue on the Upper West Side in New York City, simultaneously belonging to a Reform synagogue in Teaneck, New Jersey. And my grandmother, who was a secular Zionist folk singer, was a founding member of a modern Orthodox synagogue in the Hamptons. And other pieces fell in also.
So you have New York that's sort of like America's melting pot anyway, and your family is sort of this melting pot of Judaism in a way.
Exactly. So I've always had different influences, and then in my studies, I've also pursued different influences. So I went to Hebrew Union College, which is the Reform seminary in New York, but I also went to Pardes, which is a co-ed yeshiva, place of traditional Jewish learning in Jerusalem, the year before rabbinical school.
Okay.
And during rabbinical school, I took many opportunities to study with other seminaries, other opportunities. So I've sort of kept this I'm trying to be an internal melting pot of the Jewish world. Yeah.
So I was going to say, how do you think that influences all of those influences that you've had? How do you think that helps you in your, whether you're, writing a sermon or studying a particular piece of text or having a sort of discussion group with congregants or Jews around the community? How do you think all of those influences help direct you in that way?
Great. And that my answer to that will help tie in also to why Temple Israel is a good spot for this. So I think that when I was in rabbinical school, I articulated that one of my goals was to be able to further the conversation with any Jew.
Okay.
And so in order to further the conversation with someone, you have to be able to speak their language. And though most American Jews are speaking English, we actually all have our own sort of language of Judaism, which rituals we're most familiar with and which we care about, the slang we use, the aesthetic of prayer we're used to. And I don't want to leave anyone out from my purview. So by having this engagement across the Jewish world, I really feel that I can further the conversation with anyone that walks into Temple. And Temple Israel being such a large synagogue and pulling from many constituencies, four generation classical reform kind of Minnesotan Jews, transplants that are just, looking for a synagogue for the first time in their adulthood. Also, Jews that grew up conservative or Orthodox. There's a lot of people coming through that building, and it excited me to be able to tap into so many aspects of the community.
So because you personally and in your family and your background have so many, paths of Judaism to go down, why reform? What was it about HUC and the reform, the modern reform movement that best fit you now at this time?
Yeah, so picking a rabbinical school was not the easiest decision for me. I actually applied to 3 different rabbinical schools and got into those 3 schools, and at times each of them was crossed off the list of where I wanted to go, and at times each floated to the top. And but what it really boiled down to was the Hebrew Union College, which has 4 campuses, just had the professors that I wanted to learn from, the academic philosophy that I think should inform a modern rabbinate, and those other pieces of Judaism from the other movements. For example, I do like sort of a traditional praying experience of davening, as it's called, using a lot of the Hebrew liturgy and whatnot. I knew that because I'm an independent learner, I could supplement outside the classroom and get a more traditional experience here, meet up with my Orthodox friends there, and sort of color around the edges. But in terms of where I felt philosophically aligned, the Reform movement was it. And it's proven the resources of the school also created an incredible experience. I actually started rabbinical school unable to speak to a taxi driver in Israel in Hebrew, even after living there for a year.
Really?
Because Pardes is a very Anglo community.
Okay.
And then my first year of HUC in Jerusalem, I just barely snuck into the highest level Hebrew level, which meant that more than half of my classes were taught in Hebrew completely by Israelis. And my Hebrew level went up to fluency in the course of a year, pretty much fluency.
Okay.
And that was really fostered by the depth of our program in Jerusalem. So the school it's the oldest rabbinical school in America.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably the biggest, at least certainly by our 4-campus model. And so it just was a great learning ground for me.
So now this job at Temple Israel, your first job out of out of school, you're not coming into like a small congregation. It's pretty big. The size of Temple Israel isn't daunting at all.
Well, I'm fortunate in that I've worked in the smallest possible synagogue and one of the biggest ones already.
Okay.
My first internship was at the North Fork Reform Synagogue in Eastern Long Island.
Okay.
They, as a community, only meet every other Shabbat. Okay. When their rabbinic intern, for a year, travels out there, stays for a Shabbat, and leads services. And services draw 15 to 20 people, and the Hebrew school has 2 to 3 kids at a time flowing through it.
And you're teaching the Hebrew school
Teaching the Hebrew school in the morning, is Saturday morning, leading a Havdalah adult ed group in the evening, Saturday evening. And so there I felt, it was my first gig, and I got to be the kolbo, we call it, you're doing everything.
Right.
And it was really fun to be front and center, get a sermon opportunity every 2 weeks. But then the next 2 years, these last 2 years, I was working at B'nai Jeshurun in New York City, affectionately known as BJ, which is an independent synagogue with both conservative and reform clergy. The aesthetic of it, while very musical, tends towards the conservative side.
Okay.
Uses the conservative prayer book. And it's a renowned synagogue for its musical vision of the service, and also its social justice emphasis. And it's not quite Temple Israel size, but it's a clergy team that, including part-timers, is 6 people or so, just like
Wow.
Temple Israel is.
Yeah.
And a big staff. So I got to we do one of our high holiday services at Jazz at Lincoln Center, which is a 3-tiered balcony, I think.
Wow.
So it got me.
That's big.
It got me into that, a little bit more comfortable with that public speaking role of, speaking in front of a really large group,
Sure.
not just and so now I've given my first couple Divrei Torah at Temple Israel already, and led some services already, and done a funeral already, and I do feel pretty comfortable in those spots.
So now, you mentioned the high holidays. Those are, of course, coming up. We are as we record this, a few short weeks away from Rosh Hashanah. What is it like? You've been through the training and everything, but does it feel different as a, quote unquote, professional rabbi, having graduated, and this is now your job? Does it feel different in preparation this year than it has in the past?
I do feel that, in general, it feels sort of all in a progression and not a huge break or huge new experience. But I do feel that, especially as I approach my sermons, which have yet to be fleshed out, that I'm now not just sort of a guest to a community, but I'm really a voice within a community. And so people are going to be listening very keenly. And so there is an extra excitement and pressure to really deliver a thoughtful sermon that will then be also a platform for congregants to engage with me, because I'm meeting some, but for many, the high holidays will be their first time seeing this new face and knowing, this new face is going to stick around. So I really want to get off on a good foot in that regard. And I'm really excited. One of my roles is to be in the creative service, which is led by our youth group choir.
Oh, very fun.
Which is an institution for Temple Israel, and many people come to that service, young and old. It's not a kid service; it's just an alternative service.
Sure.
And so I'm excited to see how we navigate leading this service with a 30-40 person choir. And Rabbi Glazer, he's been spearheading that, and he will be again this year. But I'm excited to learn from him and start stepping into a leadership role there.
Rabbi Glazer, obviously, among his other talents, is a guitar player.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have musical talent that you'll bring to the service?
Yeah, so Rabbi Glazer is a wonderful role model for me because I'm also one of those guitar slinging rabbis. But actually, more often, since there's already guitar slingers around me, I've been bringing my mandolin to our Kabbalat Shabbat Friday night services.
That's a great instrument.
Yes, and it adds a different color, and it's a little fun. It's just fun by nature.
Yeah.
So I play most of the string instruments. I grew up on violin,
Okay.
classical violin, then added guitar and mandolin, and got a whole bunch of instruments. It's a passion of mine outside the synagogue, and then it comes in also.
So were you like in bands or orchestras? Did you do that as a kid growing up?
I did orchestra on classical violin, but then when I started playing guitar at 18, that's when I really took off as a ardent practicer and really took control of it, and have studied various styles and have had some great teachers, and so it's one of my passions for sure. Actually, the main band that I was a part of was during my Jerusalem years. I fronted the J-Town Bluegrass Breakdown, and with for Israelis that had some North American heritage. And playing in the Shuk, playing these bluegrass concerts at Shuk bars or just in the market during the daytime. And that was a lot of fun to bring those twangy American sounds to the middle of Jerusalem.
You guys record anything, or was just
no formal recordings, but we put out some stuff. I'm not sure where to access it at this point. But I do love bluegrass in particular, so I know there's actually a lot of offerings in the Twin Cities that I'm just starting to tap into. And
it's just a great music town, period. So no matter your style, you probably have something you can find here that's worth a listen.
Yeah, definitely. My girlfriend's also a musician and a Yiddish songwriter and actress, and so we actually were in the recording studio in St. Paul last week working on a song and found a young engineer who helped us get started with that. So I'm finding the music scene here is very accessible, which is great.
That's very cool. So a Yiddish songwriter.
She's a singer, actor, dancer. And we actually met a year ago. I went to YIVO, which is a Yiddish academic organization in New York, and studied Yiddish for the whole summer, last summer. And we met because she was studying Yiddish to enhance her Yiddish theater, and I was studying Yiddish for my rabbinic thesis, which we should chat about.
Yeah.
So I came into that summer with no Yiddish and got it to a decent level for this project, which I'll explain.
So what was this project?
So I mentioned my grandmother earlier.
Yes.
And her name was Tava. Tava Roni was her stage name. She was essentially the first Israeli folk singer to come to America. She was born in Poland, grew up in Tel Aviv in the 30s when Hebrew culture was starting to resurface, and in 1947 she moved to New York with the goal of studying theater here and then going back to Israel to found a children's theater. And as a side gig, she went to perform some Israeli folk music, and people died for it. And when independence happened, people died for it all over again. And so she quickly started just touring as an Israeli folk singer all throughout North America and South America, really extensively, and performing at Israel Bonds events and in synagogues and at old, Catskills social clubs and whatnot. And recorded 2 albums in her career, a Yiddish one and a Hebrew one. And she was my grandmother growing up, and I knew some of this stuff, but it was mostly well in the past. She died about 10 years ago, and it turned out that she had left behind every receipt from a concert, every handwritten piece of sheet music that someone sent her from Israel, what are the 8-track recordings of her doing live concerts, and all this material was just sitting in our basement for years.
And you had no idea?
It's a semblance of an idea. Knew there were stacks of sheet music, but didn't. But it was Hebrew and Yiddish, and I didn't have Hebrew and Yiddish until recently, and it was just there. And so I was actually leading a service with one of my teachers, and at the end of the service, she said that guitar sounded really great. And I said, yes, this is a classical guitar I inherited from my grandmother. Have I ever told you about her? And so I gave her that spiel I just gave you. And she said, and I said, we have all these documents. We don't know what to do with them. And she said, oh, that sounds like a great capstone project. And to document and archive those things, you could study Yiddish, you could put on a concert. So I did all those things. So I spent months in creating an archive of my grandmother's work. Yeah. And then this past December, put on a concert featuring her spoken word monologues that she got started with. She was a monologist to start, a dramatic monologue deliverer. So I gave a comedic one about how even in the 40s, Tel Aviv was too loud and concerty for if you're sick. And incorporated her Yiddish music, her Hebrew repertoire, some English songs that were her classics also. And it was I actually got an Israeli rock star to fill out the bill.
Really?
Ron Eli Ron. Okay. Who, do you know the song Lach Yerushalayim? It's a classic of the sort of 60s Israeli sound. Okay. He was buddies with my grandmother, and so he's I think in his late 70s, early 80s now. But he came to this concert also, and it was the culmination of the most work I've ever put into anything, translating Yiddish lyrics and digitizing old recordings and figuring out what to pull from them, hearing my grandmother's corny jokes on the recordings, all that, and it culminated my rabbinic studies. And culminated, a blossoming of my relationship with my grandmother after she'd already passed, and was just a really nice exclamation point on the whole last 5-6 years. And
an amazing family heirloom that you've created. Mm-hmm. Now, I could ask, did the Yiddish, did the jokes and whatnot, did it play well in English, or did it not translate quite as cleanly?
Well, she actually, most of her concert recordings that I had were for an English audience.
Ah, okay.
And she was praised at how she would tell an English joke or setup and dramatize the songs, so that even though she didn't translate the songs for you, you got it because of how she set it up. But the jokes were, humor goes in trends, and they're pretty corny for getting to today's sense of humor, but they have their place, and they weren't too raunchy. So
okay, it's probably good. I think it might be scarring to hear your grandmother tell raunchy jokes.
That's true. I did find a few sort of old love notes in her letters and stuff, but it was they wrote with a higher English and
nothing too traumatic.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that sounds amazing. So are you going to try to continue that here?
So I definitely want
concert here.
I definitely want to put on an iteration of that program. HUC in New York has its own museum and its own museum curator, and she spent time with me making poster museum panels out of all these old pamphlets I had and these old concert posters in Yiddish of a performance in Brooklyn, all these one-of-a-kind handmade concert posters and whatnot. So I brought those 10 panels that we made here. Okay. So maybe, could of course fit in around Yom HaAtzmaut, Israeli Independence Day, but I'd love to put on that program once, twice, 3 times more.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Rabbi Tobias Moss, last couple questions.
Okay.
And we will let you get back to high holiday preparations.
Thank you.
Favorite Jewish food?
Favorite Jewish food? Let's see. I think as much as it is or is not a Jewish food, I think just the best kind of corned beef sandwich. And for this, I'll give a shout out to my hometown of Tenafly, New Jersey, the Tenafly Kosher Deli. You've got my favorite corned beef.
All right. On rye?
On rye.
Seeded or seedless?
I'll go seeded.
Okay. Fair. And favorite Jewish holiday?
For me, it's Passover.
Okay.
My Hebrew name is Pesach.
Oh,
Pesach
all right.
Shmuel. I was born on the third night of Passover, and the moment I made my family most proud was my 3-year-old self telling the Passover story, which we have on video, which at some point I hope will circulate the Minnesota web. Passover's always just been a special time. It's often the most fun and chaotic Jewish holiday, but it's also the most intellectual and thoughtful one, I think, at the same time. So that's pulled me in two directions, which I love.
Well, excellent. Well, Rabbi Moss, thank you so much for joining us this week. Welcome to Minnesota, and best of luck preparing for your first high holidays as a full-time professional rabbi.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks again to Rabbi Tobias Moss for joining us this week. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. If you have suggestions for people who should be on the podcast, please email me. You can get me at editor@tcjewfolk.com. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next week.